North America before European contact contained environments ranging from Arctic tundra to temperate rainforests, from arid deserts to fertile river valleys. These landscapes supported human populations for thousands of years, though the archaeological record remains incomplete and unevenly preserved. Coastal sites have been submerged by rising sea levels. Organic materials have decomposed in most soil conditions. Stone tools and occasional bone fragments constitute the primary evidence. Researchers work with limited data, extrapolating from scattered sites across a vast geography. The scale of uncertainty is considerable. What is known comes from decades of excavation, dating analysis, and careful interpretation of material remains. The North American continent presented diverse environmental zones that influenced human settlement and subsistence strategies. The Pacific coast stretched from Alaska to California, offering marine resources, temperate forests, and salmon-rich rivers. The Great Basin consisted of high desert plateaus, alkaline lakes, and sagebrush flats with limited surface water. The Rocky Mountains formed a north-south barrier with alpine meadows and mountain passes that constrained movement. The Great Plains extended from Canada to Texas, characterized by short grass and tall grass prairie supporting bison herds. The eastern woodlands contained deciduous forests, major river systems including the Mississippi and Ohio, and abundant plant and animal resources. The Southwest encompassed arid deserts, mesas, and seasonal waterways. The Arctic and subarctic zones featured tundra, boreal forests, and extreme seasonal variation. Each region imposed different constraints on human populations. Coastal areas provided shellfish, marine mammals, and migratory fish runs. These resources were reliable but required specialized knowledge and technology. Rocky shorelines, estuaries, and river mouths concentrated food sources in predictable locations. Sea level rise since the Pleistocene submerged many early coastal sites, creating gaps in the archaeological record. What remains suggests intensive use of marine resources in some areas by the Middle Holocene. River systems facilitated movement and provided freshwater fish, waterfowl, and riparian plants. Major drainages served as corridors for population dispersal and trade. Floodplains offered fertile soils and seasonal abundance, but also flood risk. Interior environments varied in productivity. Grassland supported large herbivore populations, but fewer plant foods. Desert regions required detailed knowledge of water sources and seasonal plant availability. Montane zones provided summer hunting grounds and stone for tool production, but were inaccessible during winter. Lake basins, particularly in the Great Basin, fluctuated in size and salinity according to climate patterns. When full, they supported waterfowl and marsh plants. When dry, they left alkali flats with minimal resources. Forest environments offered nuts, berries, deer, and other game, but required different hunting techniques than open country. Climate shaped resource availability across seasons. Northern regions experienced long winters with limited plant foods, requiring either stored food or high mobility to track game. Southern latitudes allowed year-round plant gathering. Rainfall patterns determined plant productivity. The Pacific Northwest received heavy precipitation, supporting dense forests and abundant salmon runs. The Southwest received minimal rainfall, concentrating populations near permanent water sources. The Great Plains experienced seasonal droughts and extreme temperature variation. These environmental gradients influenced where human populations could sustain themselves and at what densities. Topography affected movement and settlement. Mountain ranges channeled travel through specific passes. River valleys provided natural routes. Deserts created barriers that required knowledge of water sources to cross. Coastal navigation allowed movement that bypassed inland obstacles, but depended on boat technology and maritime skills. The distribution of stone suitable for tool-making further influenced settlement patterns. High-quality chert, obsidian, and basalt occurred in specific geological formations. Populations either settled near these sources or obtained material through trade networks. Environmental diversity meant no single subsistence strategy worked across the continent. Coastal groups could specialize in marine resources. Plains populations followed bison herds. Desert groups required broader diets, including seeds, cacti, and small game. Woodland populations exploited seasonal abundance of nuts and migratory animals. This regional variation produced distinct archaeological signatures. Stone tool types reflected local raw materials and target species. Site locations clustered near productive resource zones. Seasonal camps appeared in areas used only part of the year. The absence of large domesticated animals in most of North America, aside from dogs, meant human labor powered all transport and processing activities. This influenced settlement patterns and group size. Without pack animals, mobility required carrying all possessions. Storage pits and caches allowed populations to leave materials at seasonal camps rather than transport everything continuously. The lack of animal traction also affected agricultural potential in regions where farming eventually developed. Plant communities changed with latitude and elevation. Northern boreal forests contained spruce, fir, and pine with limited understory. Temperate deciduous forests offered oak, hickory, and chestnut with productive nut harvests. Grasslands provided seed-bearing grasses and forbs. Deserts contained mesquite, agave, and various cacti. Coastal zones supported berry bushes and root vegetables. Each plant community required specific knowledge for effective exploitation. Processing techniques varied by plant type. Acorns needed leaching to remove tannins. Grass seeds required grinding. Roots needed cooking to break down fibers. Animal populations likewise varied by environment. Bison dominated the plains. Caribou ranged across the Arctic and subarctic. Deer inhabited forests and forest edges. Desert bighorn sheep occupied arid mountains. Marine mammals appeared along coasts. Salmon runs occurred in Pacific drainages. Each species required different hunting techniques and offered different nutritional profiles. Large game provided concentrated protein and fat, but unpredictable returns. Small game and fish offered reliable but lower yield options. Shellfish required minimal skill to harvest, but provided less nutrition per unit of effort than most alternatives. Geographic knowledge was essential for survival. Populations needed to know water source locations, seasonal plant availability, animal migration routes, and stone source locations. This knowledge accumulated over generations and was transmitted through social learning. Groups that lost this knowledge through population disruption faced severe disadvantages. The environmental diversity of North America meant successful populations required extensive local expertise rather than generalized survival skills applicable everywhere. Archaeological evidence indicates human presence across North America by approximately 11,500 years ago. The Clovis culture represents the earliest widespread and well-documented population, identified by distinctive fluted projectile points found from Alaska to Central America. These points appear in the archaeological record around 11,200 years ago and persist for roughly 300 years. Clovis sites occur across diverse environments, suggesting rapid dispersal or pre-existing population spread. The technology shows remarkable consistency in form, despite geographic separation, though regional variations exist in raw material and manufacturing details. Debate continues regarding pre-Clovis occupation. Some researchers argue for human presence before 12,000 years ago, based on sites in Pennsylvania, Texas, Oregon, and Chile. Others question the dating, stratigraphy, or cultural attribution of these sites. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania contains layers dated to 16,000 years ago, with possible stone tools. But natural processes may have introduced these materials. The Paisley Caves in Oregon yielded coprolites dated to 14,000 years ago, though some archaeologists dispute whether these represent human or animal remains. Monteverde in Chile shows more convincing evidence for occupation by 14,500 years ago, but its distance from North American sites complicates migration models. The pre-Clovis debate centers on evidence quality and dating reliability. Organic materials can be contaminated by younger or older carbon, producing incorrect dates. Stone flakes may result from natural fracturing rather than human manufacture. Association between dates and artifacts must be demonstrated through careful excavation. Many early claims have not withstood scrutiny. The absence of clear pre-Clovis sites across North America, despite extensive survey, suggests either limited population size, different settlement patterns that left minimal traces, or actual absence before 11,500 years ago. Clovis points typically measure between 4 and 15 centimeters in length. Fluting involves removing one or more channel flakes from the base, thinning the point for hafting onto wooden or bone shafts. This technique required considerable skill and resulted in high breakage rates during manufacture. The function of fluting remains debated. It may have facilitated hafting, improved penetration, or served social signaling purposes. Clovis points appear alongside scrapers, blades, and bone tools at kill sites and camps. The technology was clearly effective for hunting, but also reflected significant investment of time and material. Clovis sites cluster in certain regions while remaining sparse or absent in others. The Great Plains contain numerous sites, particularly near ancient water sources that attracted game animals. The Southeast shows moderate Clovis presence. The Great Basin has few Clovis points despite later intensive occupation. The Pacific Northwest contains limited Clovis evidence, though this may reflect coastal site submersion. The distribution pattern suggests either uneven population density or differential preservation. Sites near permanent water sources are more common, consistent with hunting strategies focused on animals concentrated at springs and lakes during dry periods. Most Clovis sites are small, suggesting high mobility and low population density. Large base camps are rare. Instead, the archaeological record consists primarily of kill sites where animals were butchered, short-term camps, and stone tool manufacturing locations near raw material sources. This pattern indicates groups moved frequently across large territories, exploiting resources as they became available seasonally. The lack of substantial structures or storage features supports this interpretation. Portable toolkits dominated, with people carrying essential items and manufacturing new tools as needed from locally available stone. Evidence of Clovis subsistence comes from kill sites, where bone preservation allows species identification. Mammoth remains appear at several sites, though whether these represent hunting or scavenging is debated. Other sites contain bison, horse, and camel bones. Smaller animals and plant foods likely contributed significantly to diet, but rarely preserve. The focus on large game in the archaeological record may reflect preservation bias rather than actual subsistence emphasis. Stone tools where patterns suggest hide processing, woodworking, and plant processing occurred alongside animal butchery. The relationship between Clovis populations and Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions remains controversial. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, and other large species disappeared around 11,000 years ago. Some researchers argue human hunting pressure contributed to or caused these extinctions. Others emphasize climate change and habitat disruption as primary factors. The temporal overlap between Clovis appearance and extinctions is suggestive, but not conclusive. Multiple species disappeared before widespread Clovis presence. Some survived longer in regions with minimal human population. The extinction pattern was complex and likely involved multiple factors. Stone tool raw material sources indicate Clovis groups either traveled long distances or maintained exchange networks. Points manufactured from stone sources hundreds of kilometers from recovery locations appear at multiple sites. This movement may represent seasonal migration circuits, trade between groups, or individual exchange relationships. The presence of exotic materials demonstrates connections across regional boundaries. Whether these connections involved direct travel or down-the-line exchange through intermediary groups cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone. Clovis technology disappears from the archaeological record around 10,900 years ago. Subsequent populations use different projectile point styles and manufacturing techniques. Whether this represents population replacement, cultural change within existing populations, or both remains unclear. The transition corresponds roughly with megafaunal extinctions and climate changes at the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary. New point types appear regionally, suggesting increased cultural diversification. The uniformity that characterized Clovis technology gave way to regional traditions, with distinct tool forms and manufacturing techniques. The scarcity of Clovis burials limits understanding of social organization and ideology. Few human remains from this period have been recovered. One burial in Montana contained a young child with multiple stone tools and bone artifacts, suggesting some social differentiation or at minimum provision for the deceased. Red ochre occurred in the burial, indicating symbolic behavior. The paucity of burial evidence may reflect small population size, different treatment of the dead that left no archaeological trace, or preservation failures. What exists suggests at least some groups practiced intentional burial with grave goods. Clovis camps show evidence of structured activity areas. Stone tool manufacturing debris clusters in specific locations. Hearths occur in central areas. Bone processing happened in designated spots. This spatial organization indicates planned use of camp space and possibly repeated occupation of favored locations. The patterns are consistent with small groups, likely extended families, camping together for short periods before moving to new locations. Group size estimates based on camp areas and artifact densities suggest perhaps 20 to 50 individuals traveled together, though these numbers remain speculative. Paleo-Indian populations following Clovis adapted to changing environments at the end of the Pleistocene. Regional point styles replaced the widespread Clovis form. Folsom points appeared on the Great Plains around 10,800 years ago, characterized by longer fluting and more refined workmanship than Clovis examples. These points were hafted onto dart shafts and propelled with atlatls. Folsom sites concentrate in areas where bison populations congregated, particularly around water sources and in grassland corridors. Kill sites contain remains of dozens of bison, indicating communal hunting efforts. Bison became the primary large game animal for plains populations after the extinction of horses, camels, and mammoths. Ancient bison were larger than modern subspecies and occurred in massive herds. Hunting strategies exploited herd behavior, driving animals into arroyos, box canyons, or constructed corrals where they could be killed efficiently. Jump sites, where bison were stampeded over cliffs, appear later in the archaeological record. Folsom hunters likely used natural terrain features to trap animals rather than engineered structures. The number of animals killed at individual sites varied from single kills to mass kills involving 50 or more bison. Butchering patterns at Folsom sites show selective transport of meat and bone. Hunters removed high-utility parts like hindquarters, tongues, and organ meats, while leaving low-utility elements at kill locations. This suggests camps were located at some distance from kill sites, requiring efficient transport decisions. Stone tools used in butchering show wear patterns, consistent with cutting meat, breaking bone, and processing hides. The presence of scrapers and other hide-working tools indicates leather production was important, likely for clothing, containers, and shelter covering. Plant foods likely constituted a significant portion of Paleo-Indian diet, but rarely preserve in archaeological contexts. Grinding stones appear at some sites, suggesting seed or root processing. Burned plant remains in hearths indicate use of various species, though identification to species level is often impossible. Seasonal camps in areas with productive plant resources imply gathering activities, but direct evidence is limited. Nutritional studies suggest reliance solely on meat would have been insufficient, particularly for fat-soluble vitamins, available primarily in plant foods and organ meats. Eastern North America shows different Paleo-Indian adaptations than the plains. Hardaway, Dalton, and other point types appear in forested regions. These populations exploited white-tailed deer, elk, and smaller game rather than bison. Forest environments provided nuts, particularly hickory and oak, which became increasingly important food sources. River valleys concentrated both animal and plant resources, leading to preferential settlement along major drainages. The Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi River systems show dense distributions of Paleo-Indian sites compared to upland areas. Great Basin Paleo-Indian populations faced different environmental constraints. Lakes that formed during the Pleistocene began shrinking in the early Holocene. Populations initially concentrated around lake margins where waterfowl, fish, and marsh plants were available. As lakes receded, groups shifted to higher mobility patterns, exploiting scattered resources across wider territories. Stemmed point traditions developed in this region, distinct from fluted point technologies elsewhere. These points appear alongside crescents, specialized tools possibly used for cutting plant materials, or as transverse projectile points. Coastal populations left limited archaeological traces due to sea level rise. By 10,000 years ago, coastlines were located kilometers offshore from modern beaches. Any sites on the Pleistocene coast are now submerged. Evidence for early coastal adaptation comes from islands that were never connected to the mainland, and from inland shell middens along ancient shorelines. California Channel Islands contain sites dated to 13,000 years ago, with marine mammal bones and stone tools, indicating maritime capabilities existed early. The extent of coastal settlement remains unknown due to preservation limitations. Paleo-Indian groups were highly mobile. Site distributions suggest seasonal rounds covering large territories. Winter camps in protected valleys gave way to spring and summer dispersal to higher elevations or productive resource zones. Fall aggregations may have occurred at locations with reliable nut harvests or animal concentrations. This mobility pattern is inferred from site types, artifact distributions, and raw material sourcing. Direct evidence of seasonal occupation comes from faunal remains showing kill seasons based on tooth eruption patterns and antler condition. Tool manufacturing strategies reflected high mobility. Paleo-Indian groups carried cores and performed tool production opportunistically as needs arose. Bifacial tools, which could be resharpened repeatedly, dominated assemblages. When tools broke, people reworked fragments into different forms rather than discarding them. This curation behavior indicates raw material was valued and conserved. Sites near high-quality stone sources show evidence of intensive core reduction and blank production, with finished tools or blanks transported elsewhere. Population density during the Paleo-Indian period was extremely low. Estimates suggest fewer than 1 person per 100 square kilometers in most regions. Total continental population may have numbered in the tens of thousands. These numbers are speculative, derived from site distributions, carrying capacity estimates, and ethnographic analogies. Low density is consistent with the scarcity of archaeological sites and the limited evidence of landscape modification. Populations were dispersed across vast territories with minimal overlap between group ranges. Social organization likely consisted of small bands of related individuals. Extended family groups of 20 to 50 people probably represented typical residential units. Larger aggregations may have occurred seasonally when resources permitted, allowing mate exchange, information sharing, and social bonding. Evidence for these gatherings is indirect, based on lithic material distributions suggesting long-distance connections and the social requirements of maintaining viable breeding populations. Isolated bands without periodic contact with other groups would face genetic and demographic problems. Conflict evidence from the Paleo-Indian period is virtually absent. No fortifications, weapons specialized for warfare, or traumatic injuries inconsistent with accidents appear in the archaeological record. This may reflect low population density reducing competition for resources, preservation bias against bone injuries, or small sample sizes. Ethnographic analogies suggest conflict between foraging groups was possible, but perhaps infrequent when population densities remained low and territories were not rigidly bounded. Symbolic behavior is evidenced by red ochre use, possible ornaments, and careful burial treatment in rare cases. Ochre appears in scattered sites, sometimes in quantities suggesting more than utilitarian use. Whether it served symbolic, ritual, or practical purposes like hide tanning cannot be determined. A few bone and stone items show modifications suggesting ornamental use, though unambiguous ornaments are rare. The scarcity of symbolic materials may reflect actual behavior, preservation bias, or archaeological recovery limitations. Climate during the Paleo-Indian period was transitioning from Pleistocene cold to Holocene warmth. Temperatures fluctuated considerably. The Younger Dryas cold interval from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago brought glacial conditions back temporarily. Paleo-Indian populations experienced these climatic shifts, adjusting settlement patterns and subsistence strategies accordingly. How climate change affected population size and distribution remains debated. Some researchers argue environmental stress drove technological innovation. Others see minimal direct impact on human populations already adapted to environmental variability. The Pleistocene ended approximately 11,700 years ago, marking the boundary with the Holocene epoch. This transition involved significant environmental changes across North America. Continental ice sheets retreated northward, opening new territories for colonization. Glacial meltwater raised sea levels by over 100 meters, submerging coastal plains and river valleys. Temperatures increased, though not uniformly or steadily. The Younger Dryas cold interval had ended several centuries earlier, but climate continued fluctuating throughout the early Holocene. Vegetation zones shifted in response to warming temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. Spruce forests that dominated northern latitudes retreated as deciduous species expanded their ranges. Grasslands spread across interior regions as conditions became drier. Desert areas in the southwest intensified in aridity. These vegetation changes occurred over centuries and millennia, not instantaneously. Plant species migrated at different rates depending on dispersal mechanisms and ecological requirements. Animal populations tracked vegetation changes, with some species expanding ranges while others contracted or disappeared. Megafaunal extinctions eliminated most large herbivores and their predators. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and short-faced bears all vanished by 10,000 years ago. Only bison, caribou, moose, elk, deer, and pronghorn remained among large mammals. The causes of these extinctions remain debated. Human hunting pressure, climate change, habitat loss, and disease have all been proposed. The pattern was global, with large mammals disappearing on most continents around the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, though timing varied regionally. The loss of megafauna fundamentally altered North American ecosystems. Large herbivores had shaped vegetation through browsing and grazing. Their disappearance allowed woody vegetation to expand in some areas and changed fire regimes. Predator-prey relationships reorganized around smaller animals. Human populations dependent on mammoth or other extinct species had to adapt subsistence strategies. The shift toward smaller game, increased plant gathering, and more diverse diets characterizes post-Pleistocene archaeology across the continent. Bison populations adapted to changing grassland conditions. The species decreased in size compared to Pleistocene ancestors, but increased in numbers. Herds remained a primary food source for plains populations throughout the Holocene. However, bison distribution fluctuated with climate and grassland extent. During dry periods, herds concentrated in areas with reliable water and forage. During wet periods, they dispersed more widely. Human hunting strategies had to accommodate these fluctuations, requiring knowledge of seasonal movements and environmental conditions affecting herd behavior. Lake levels in the Great Basin fluctuated dramatically during the early Holocene. Large Pleistocene lakes like Bonneville and La Hontan shrank to fractions of their former size. Ancient shorelines now stand far above current water levels, marking maximum lake extents. As lakes receded, marshes and wetlands disappeared. Waterfowl populations declined. Fish became concentrated in remaining water bodies or disappeared entirely from closed basins. Human populations initially settled along receding shorelines, but eventually had to adopt different strategies as aquatic resources diminished. The climate of the early to middle Holocene was generally warmer and often drier than present across much of North America. This period, sometimes called the hypsithermal or altithermal, peaked between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago. Temperatures in some regions exceeded modern levels by several degrees. Precipitation patterns shifted, with some areas becoming more arid, while others received increased rainfall. These changes affected resource availability and required adaptive responses from human populations. On the Great Plains, increased aridity reduced surface water availability. Springs and small streams dried up. Human populations concentrated near permanent water sources, like major rivers. Archaeological sites from this period cluster along the Missouri, Platte, and Arkansas river systems. Occupation of interfluves and upland areas declined. Bison populations may have decreased or shifted ranges in response to forage limitations. Human population density likely remained low, constrained by water scarcity and resource distribution. Eastern forests experienced warming and drying as well, though impacts varied regionally. Oak and hickory expanded at the expense of mesic species. Prairie vegetation extended eastward into areas previously forested. Fire frequency may have increased, whether from natural causes or human activity. Despite these changes, the eastern woodlands remained more productive than grassland or desert regions. Nut-bearing trees provided storable, calorie-dense foods. Deer populations remained stable. River systems offered fish and mussels. Human populations in forested regions show evidence of population growth during this period. Pacific coast environments were buffered from extreme temperature changes by oceanic influences. Marine resources remained relatively stable. Salmon runs continued in major river systems. Shellfish beds along rocky shores provided reliable harvests. Coastal populations developed increasingly specialized maritime adaptations. The archaeological record shows intensified use of marine resources through time, though early evidence is limited by coastal site submersion. By the Middle Holocene, substantial shell middens indicate concentrated coastal occupation in California and the Pacific Northwest. The Southwest became increasingly arid during the Middle Holocene. Desert vegetation expanded. Water sources became scarce outside of major river valleys and mountain ranges. Human populations remained small and highly mobile. Archaeological sites are sparse compared to earlier or later periods. Some researchers interpret this as population decline or abandonment of the most arid zones. Others argue preservation bias or changes in settlement patterns that produced less visible archaeological signatures account for the apparent gap. Climate fluctuations affected resource predictability and abundance. Populations had to maintain flexibility in subsistence strategies and settlement patterns. Years of drought reduced plant productivity and concentrated animals near remaining water. Flooding destroyed riverside camps and disrupted seasonal rounds. Unseasonable frosts killed nut crops. Populations with diversified subsistence bases and knowledge of alternative resource zones were better positioned to weather these variations than those dependent on limited resources. Technological adaptations to changing environments included shifts in projectile point styles and manufacturing techniques. The atlatl remained the primary hunting weapon, but dart point forms diversified regionally. Corner-notched, side-notched, and stemmed varieties appeared, each potentially optimized for different prey or hafting methods. Grinding tools became more common as seed processing intensified. Manos and metates designed for grinding small seeds appear in increasing numbers, particularly in arid regions where seeds replace diminishing animal resources. Fishing technology developed in regions with reliable fish populations. Bone fish hooks appear in coastal sites. Net weights made from notched stones indicate net fishing in rivers and lakes. Fish weirs constructed from stones or wooden stakes channeled migrating fish into traps. These technologies required investment in facilities and coordination of labor, but provided reliable yields. Seasonal fish runs, particularly salmon in Pacific drainages, became focal points for population aggregation and intensive processing. Storage strategies became increasingly important as populations grew and mobility decreased. Pits lined with bark or grass preserved nuts, seeds, and dried meat. Elevated caches protected foods from moisture and rodents. Some groups constructed more substantial storage facilities, suggesting longer occupation of base camps and reduced residential mobility. Stored foods buffered seasonal scarcity and allowed populations to remain in productive locations rather than moving constantly. Fire use for landscape management may have increased during the Holocene, though evidence is debated. Selective burning maintained desirable plant communities, increased browse for deer, and facilitated nut collection by clearing understory vegetation. Charcoal frequencies in soil cores increase in some regions during the Middle Holocene, suggesting more frequent burning. Whether this reflects human activity, natural fire regime changes due to climate, or both cannot always be determined. Ethnographic accounts describe systematic burning by later populations, suggesting the practice has considerable antiquity. Population increases during the Middle Holocene are inferred from site frequency and density. More sites from this period appear in the archaeological record than from Paleo-Indian times. Site sizes increase in some regions, suggesting larger corecident groups or longer occupation spans. However, these patterns vary regionally. Some areas show apparent population decline while others expand. Overall continental population likely increased, though exact numbers remain speculative. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million by 5,000 years ago. The period following the climatic maximum saw diversification of subsistence strategies and increasing regional variation in material culture. Populations adapted to local environmental conditions rather than maintaining continent-wide technological uniformity. The archaeological record from 8,000 to 3,000 years ago shows distinct regional traditions, with limited overlap in tool forms, site types, and settlement patterns. This diversification reflects both environmental adaptation and the accumulation of localized knowledge passed through generations. Eastern populations developed what archaeologists term archaic cultures, characterized by diverse toolkits and broad-spectrum foraging. These groups exploited nuts, seeds, roots, fish, shellfish, deer, and numerous smaller animals. Sites occur in rock shelters, river terraces, and upland camps, indicating use of multiple environmental zones throughout the year. Groundstone tools including axes, adzes, and grinding implements appear in greater quantities than earlier periods. These tools facilitated woodworking, nut processing, and seed grinding. Shell middens along rivers and coasts in the eastern woodlands document intensive shellfish harvesting. Freshwater mussels from the Tennessee, Green, and other river systems accumulated in massive deposits, some extending over hectares and reaching several meters in depth. These middens contain stone tools, bone implements, fire-cracked rock from cooking, and occasional human burials. The size of middens indicates repeated occupation over centuries or millennia. Whether occupation was year-round or seasonal remains debated, varying by location and time period. Fishing in eastern rivers intensified during this period. Bone fish hooks, stone net weights, and concentrations of fish bone at sites indicate systematic harvesting. Catfish, gar, drum, and other species were taken. Seasonal fish spawning runs provided predictable resources that could be harvested in large quantities and preserved through drying or smoking. The reliability of these resources may have enabled longer stays at productive locations rather than constant movement. Nut harvesting became increasingly important in forested regions. Hickory nuts and acorns provided storable calories and fats. Population scheduled movements to coincide with nut harvests in the fall. Processing nuts required substantial labor. Hickory nuts needed cracking and kernel extraction. Acorns required leaching to remove bitter tannins before consumption. Despite labor requirements, the caloric return justified the effort. Some sites contain massive quantities of hickory nutshell, indicating processing on scales, suggesting group aggregations or intensive harvesting. Trade networks developed across regional boundaries. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic appears in interior sites hundreds of kilometers from source areas. Copper from the Lake Superior region was worked into tools and ornaments distributed across the eastern woodlands. High-quality stone from specific quarries appears far from geological sources. Whether these materials moved through direct expeditions, down-the-line exchange between neighboring groups, or specialized traders cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone. The presence of exotic materials demonstrates connections between distant populations. Burial practices became more elaborate in some regions. Cemeteries containing multiple individuals appear rather than isolated burials. Grave goods, including stone tools, shell beads, copper ornaments, and red ochre, accompany some burials. The variation in burial treatment suggests social differentiation, with some individuals receiving more elaborate interment than others. Whether this reflects achieved status, inherited rank, age, gender, or other social categories is unclear. The investment of labor in burial preparation and the inclusion of valuable items indicate beliefs about death and possibly afterlife. Great Lakes populations adapted to the unique resources of this region. Fishing in the lakes and connecting rivers provided substantial portions of diet. Sturgeon, whitefish, and other species were harvested. Copper from native deposits was cold-hammered into tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. The old copper complex, appearing around 6,000 years ago, produced projectile points, knives, awls, and fishhooks from pure copper. These items were laboriously manufactured and sometimes placed in burials. The tradition eventually declined, with later populations using copper primarily for ornaments rather than functional tools. Plains populations continued focusing on bison, but with regional variations in hunting strategies and processing methods. Communal kills at jumps and traps became more common. Head-smashed-in buffalo jump in Alberta shows repeated use over thousands of years, with bone deposits accumulating to great depths. Organization of these hunts required coordination among multiple groups and detailed knowledge of bison behavior. The meat harvested from successful kills exceeded immediate consumption needs, requiring preservation through drying and storage. Processing bison for storage involved removing meat in thin strips for drying. Bone was broken to extract marrow. Hides were scraped and processed for leather. Sinew was extracted for cordage and sewing. Hooves and horns provided raw material for tools and containers. The intensive processing visible at kill sites indicates populations utilized virtually all parts of carcasses. Stone tools designed for specific tasks appear in numbers corresponding to processing requirements, with scrapers, knives, and choppers dominating assemblages. Great Basin populations faced increasing aridity and shrinking water sources during the Middle Holocene. Settlement concentrated along the edges of remaining lakes and in mountain valleys with permanent streams. Mobility patterns adjusted to resource distribution, with groups traveling long distances between productive zones. Plant foods, particularly seeds, became dietary staples. Ground stone implements for processing small seeds appear in abundance. Basketry, though rarely preserved, was essential for seed collection and processing. Wetland resources in the Great Basin provided critical foods when available. Marshes supported waterfowl, fish, and aquatic plants. Cattail and bulrush rhizomes were harvested and processed. These wetlands fluctuated with water levels, expanding during wet periods and contracting during droughts. Archaeological sites cluster around former wetland margins, suggesting populations tracked these productive zones as they shifted. When wetlands dried completely, populations had to rely more heavily on upland seed resources and small game. California populations developed increasingly specialized adaptations to diverse environmental zones. Coastal groups harvested shellfish, marine mammals, and fish. Interior valley populations exploited riverine resources and gathered acorns. Mountain groups hunted deer and collected pine nuts. The diversity of environments within relatively small areas allowed populations to access varied resources without extensive travel. Regional populations developed distinct tool traditions and subsistence emphases reflecting local conditions. Acorn harvesting in California required substantial processing infrastructure. Bedrock mortars, created by grinding acorns in natural rock depressions, appear across oak woodland zones. These mortars were used repeatedly, developing deep, smooth bowls through sustained use over generations. The investment in fixed processing facilities suggests populations returned to specific locations annually. Acorn storage in granaries or cache pits allowed consumption throughout the year. The reliability and abundance of acorn crops in productive years made them dietary staples. Pacific Northwest populations developed maritime adaptations focused on salmon, marine mammals, and shellfish. River systems draining to the Pacific supported massive salmon runs. Fish were harvested during spawning migrations using spears, nets, and weirs. The abundance of salmon allowed populations to harvest thousands of fish in short periods. Processing involved filleting, drying, and smoking to create preserved food lasting months. The reliability of salmon runs enabled increasingly sedentary settlement patterns in favored locations. Marine mammal hunting along the Pacific coast required specialized technology and skills. Sea lions, seals, and potentially whales were taken. Bone harpoons with detachable heads appear in coastal sites. These weapons were designed to penetrate blubber and remain embedded as animals attempted to escape. Hunting from boats required maritime knowledge and equipment. The presence of marine mammal bones at archaeological sites demonstrates these capabilities existed, though the extent of offshore hunting versus coastal opportunistic acquisition varies by region and period. Technological innovations during this period included improved atlatl designs, specialized projectile points for different prey, and refined groundstone tools. Banner stones. Polished stone weights attached to atlatl shafts may have improved throwing velocity or accuracy. Their elaborate manufacture and occasional inclusion in burials suggest possible symbolic significance beyond functional purposes. Specialized point forms optimized for fishing, bird hunting, or large game appear in appropriate environmental contexts. Population growth during the Middle and Late Archaic periods is indicated by increasing site densities and sizes. Cemeteries containing hundreds of individuals suggest substantial populations using specific areas over extended periods. Competition for productive resource zones may have intensified. Territorial boundaries possibly became more defined, though direct evidence is limited. The accumulation of cultural deposits at repeatedly occupied locations demonstrates populations were less mobile than Paleo-Indian ancestors. Stone tool manufacturing traditions became increasingly regionalized between 5,000 and 2,000 years ago. Distinct point styles, blade technologies, and groundstone forms characterize different geographic areas. The eastern woodlands developed notched and stemmed point varieties distinct from plains side-notched forms, which differed from Great Basin stemmed traditions and California leaf-shaped points. These regional patterns reflect functional adaptations to local prey species, available raw materials, and accumulated technical knowledge specific to each area. Groundstone technology expanded beyond simple manos and metates to include specialized forms for different processing tasks. Mortars and pestles appeared in regions where hard seeds or nuts required pounding rather than grinding. Grooved axes facilitated tree felling and woodworking. Celts, ungrooved axe-like tools, were hafted for chopping and shaping wood. Polished stone atlatl weights, pipes, and ornaments demonstrate technical skill in shaping hard stone through pecking, grinding, and polishing. The labor investment in these objects indicates their value exceeded immediate functional returns. Groundstone tool production required access to appropriate raw materials. Granite, basalt, and other hard stones suitable for axes and grinding implements occur in specific geological formations. Populations either settled near these sources or obtained finished tools through exchange. Quarry sites show evidence of initial rough-out production, with final shaping occurring elsewhere. The distribution of tools manufactured from distinctive stone types traces movement patterns or exchange relationships across hundreds of kilometers. Atlatl technology reached its peak sophistication during this period before being replaced by the bow and arrow in most regions. Atlatl weights, or banner stones, occurred in numerous styles, including winged, butterfly, and tubular forms. These objects were carefully shaped and polished, requiring substantial manufacturing time. Whether they primarily improved throwing performance or served social and symbolic functions remains debated. Their inclusion in elite burials suggests status associations beyond simple hunting tools. Boats and watercraft enabled exploitation of aquatic resources and facilitated movement along rivers and coastlines. Direct evidence of boats from this period is limited due to organic preservation requirements. Dugout canoes appear in waterlogged contexts in Florida and other locations. These canoes were manufactured by burning and scraping logs to create hollowed vessels. Sizes varied from small single-person craft to large canoes capable of carrying multiple people and cargo. The distribution of sites on islands never connected to mainlands proves watercraft existed, though their specific forms remain uncertain. Fishing technology diversified to exploit different species and environments. Bone and antler composite fish hooks with separate points lashed to shanks appear in coastal and riverine sites. Stone gorges, small pointed stones designed to lodge in fish throats, were attached to lines. Net sinkers show regional variation in form, from simple notched cobbles to carefully shaped geometric forms. Fish traps constructed from stone walls directed migrating fish into enclosures. These varied technologies indicate detailed knowledge of fish behavior and seasonal movements. Specialized hunting weapons for bird hunting included small, finely made projectile points, distinct from those used for larger game. Waterfowl hunting in wetland environments provided seasonal abundance. Bone whistles or calls may have attracted birds within range. Net hunting likely occurred, though direct evidence is limited. The presence of waterfowl bones at sites far from wetlands indicates either long-distance transport of processed meat or movement of entire groups to seasonal hunting locations. Woodworking technology left limited direct archaeological traces, but can be inferred from stone tools and rare preserved wooden objects. Axes and adzes shaped timbers for structures, boats, and other purposes. Wedges split logs and planks from larger timbers. Fire was used to fell trees and hollow logs. The technical knowledge required for efficient woodworking was substantial, involving understanding of wood grain, moisture content, and species-specific properties. Structures, when preserved, show sophisticated joinery and construction techniques. Storage technologies expanded as populations became more sedentary and as resource intensification produced surpluses requiring preservation. Bell-shaped pits excavated into subsoil provided cool, dry storage for nuts, seeds, and dried meat. Some pits were lined with bark, grass, or clay to improve preservation. Cache pits in rock shelters protected materials from moisture and animals. Above-ground granaries, though rarely preserved archaeologically, were likely used based on ethnographic parallels and occasional carbonized structural remains. Food processing innovations included earth ovens for cooking plant foods that required extended heating to break down fibers and toxins. Pits were lined with stones, heated with fire, then filled with food items and covered to retain heat. Agave, camas, and other roots were processed this way in appropriate regions. The presence of fire-cracked rock, stones fractured from repeated heating and cooling, marks locations where this technology was employed. Accumulations of fire-cracked rock suggest intensive and repeated use of specific processing locations. Basketry and cordage technologies, though rarely preserved, were essential for gathering, processing, and storing plant foods. When preserved in dry caves, baskets show sophisticated twining and coiling techniques. Different forms served different functions, from tightly woven seed beaters to loosely constructed carrying baskets. Cordage was manufactured from plant fibers, animal sinew, and hide strips. Nets for fishing and hunting required substantial amounts of cordage and represented significant labor investments. Hide processing techniques refined over millennia produced leather for clothing, containers, shelter covers, and cordage. Scrapers show wear patterns consistent with hide scraping. Bone beamers, tools for removing hair and flesh, appear in some assemblages. Tanning processes likely involved brain tanning or vegetable tanning using bark or plant extracts, though direct evidence is limited. The ubiquity of hide-working tools indicates leather production was routine and essential. Ceramic technology appeared in some regions during this period, though adoption was geographically variable. The earliest ceramics in North America appear in the Southeast around 4,500 years ago. These early vessels were fiber-tempered, with plant fibers added to clay to prevent cracking during firing. Pottery allowed new cooking methods, particularly boiling, and provided storage containers for liquids and seeds. The technology spread slowly, with many regions not adopting ceramics until much later, or not at all. Early pottery forms were simple, thick-walled vessels with pointed or rounded bottoms. Decoration was minimal or absent. Firing temperatures were relatively low, producing somewhat fragile vessels. Despite limitations, pottery provided advantages over alternative container technologies. Unlike baskets, ceramic vessels could be placed directly in fire. Unlike hide containers, they did not require constant maintenance. The presence of pottery at a site indicates at least semi-sedentary occupation, as fragile ceramic vessels were poorly suited to frequent transport. Stone pipe manufacturing appeared in some regions, indicating smoking of tobacco or other plants. Pipes were carved from soft stones like catlinite or soapstone. Forms varied from simple tubes to elaborate effigy shapes. The labor investment in pipe manufacture and their inclusion in burials suggests significance beyond simple smoking implements. Whether pipes were used for medicinal, ritual, or recreational purposes cannot be determined archaeologically. Ethnographic accounts describe various uses, likely reflecting ancient practices. Regional exchange networks intensified and extended greater distances. Marine shell from both Gulf and Atlantic coasts appears in the interior Midwest. Obsidian from Rocky Mountain sources occurs in plains sites. Copper from the Great Lakes reached the southeast. High-quality cherts and chalcedonies moved from quarries to distant locations. The volume of exotic materials increased through time, suggesting more frequent exchange or more formalized trade relationships. Whether exchange occurred through reciprocal gift-giving, barter, or specialized traders remains unclear. Climate conditions between 5,000 and 2,000 years ago generally stabilized after the Middle Holocene thermal maximum. Temperatures moderated to levels similar to or slightly cooler than present. Precipitation patterns varied regionally, with some areas experiencing increased moisture, while others remained relatively dry. These conditions allowed vegetation communities to reach configurations resembling those encountered by European explorers. Forest compositions in the east, grassland extents on the plains, and desert boundaries in the southwest approached modern distributions, though local variations continued in response to shorter-term climate fluctuations. The eastern woodlands experienced expansion of deciduous forests dominated by oak, hickory, chestnut, and other nut-bearing species. These forests provided abundant and predictable food resources. Nut harvests in productive years yielded surplus calories that could be stored through winter and beyond. Populations scheduled seasonal movements to exploit nut groves at optimal harvest times. The predictability of these resources enabled larger group sizes and longer occupation of base camps compared to earlier periods. Archaeological sites from this period are larger and contain more substantial cultural deposits than those from the Middle Holocene. White-tailed deer populations thrived in the diverse forest and edge environments created by the mosaic of mature forest, early successional growth, and potentially human-managed clearings. Deer provided meat, hides, bone for tools, and antler for implement manufacture. Hunting strategies included individual stalking, communal drives, and possibly snares and traps. The abundance of deer remains in faunal assemblages indicates these animals were dietary staples across the eastern woodlands. Seasonality of kills, determined from tooth eruption and antler development, shows year-round hunting with possible intensification during fall. Riverine resources in eastern North America were exploited intensively. Freshwater mussels continued to be harvested in enormous quantities. Fish, turtles, waterfowl, and aquatic mammals contributed to diets. Some river valleys show nearly continuous distributions of sites along terraces and floodplains, suggesting dense settlement. These locations provided access to multiple resource zones within short distances. Forests on uplands, floodplain gardens in later periods, and aquatic resources in rivers created diverse subsistence bases requiring limited travel. The Great Plains saw continued focus on bison hunting, but with increasing evidence of organized communal kills. Jump sites and pound sites, where animals were driven into constructed enclosures, became more common. Archaeological evidence includes drive lanes marked by stone cairns, processing areas with dense bone deposits, and associated camp locations. The coordination required for successful communal hunts suggests social organization capable of mobilizing multiple family groups. Leadership structures necessary for planning and executing hunts may have emerged, though archaeological evidence for formalized leadership is limited. Bison kill sites show increasing efficiency in processing methods. Butchering patterns indicate detailed anatomical knowledge and standardized processing sequences. Meat was removed systematically. Bone marrow was extracted through controlled fracturing. Hides were removed and processed for leather. The volume of bone at major kill sites indicates hundreds of animals were processed during successful hunts. Preservation of this meat required drying, allowing storage for months. The ability to accumulate surplus food through successful hunts affected settlement patterns and group organization. Plant resources on the plains included prairie turnips, various seeds, and berries. These foods supplemented bison meat and provided essential nutrients absent from purely meat-based diets. Grinding implements for seed processing appear at plains sites, indicating plant gathering was routine. The contribution of plant foods to overall diet is difficult to assess due to preservation bias favoring bone over botanical remains. Ethnographic accounts from plains groups describe substantial plant gathering efforts, particularly by women, suggesting similar practices existed in prehistory. The Southwest during this period saw population expansion into previously underutilized areas. Increased precipitation in some regions made farming experiments possible. Wild plant resources, including mesquite beans, cactus fruits, yucca, and agave, were intensively exploited. Small game such as rabbits and rodents supplemented diets where large game was scarce. The diversity of resources used, indicated by broad faunal and botanical assemblages, reflects adaptation to environments with low primary productivity and high resource unpredictability. Pite house structures appear in the Southwest around 3,000 years ago. These semi-subterranean dwellings were excavated into the ground and covered with roofs of poles and earth. Pite houses provided thermal insulation against temperature extremes and represented investment in specific locations. The presence of pit houses indicates reduced mobility and longer occupation of sites compared to earlier periods. Villages of multiple pit houses suggest coresidential groups larger than single extended families. Early agricultural experiments in the Southwest involved maize, introduced from Mesoamerica. The earliest maize in the American Southwest dates to approximately 4,000 years ago, based on accelerator mass spectrometry dating of kernels and cobs. However, maize remained a minor dietary component for over a millennium. Wild resources continued to dominate subsistence. The slow adoption of agriculture reflects environmental constraints, cultural preferences, and the adequacy of existing foraging strategies. Only when population pressure increased or climate conditions favored farming did agriculture intensify. California populations developed some of the most intensive foraging economies in North America. Acorn harvesting and processing reached industrial scales in some regions. Salmon runs in northern rivers supported dense populations. Marine resources along the extensive coastline provided reliable harvests. The productivity of California environments allowed sedentary villages without agriculture. Population densities in some areas rivaled those of agricultural societies elsewhere. Social complexity emerged among groups subsisting entirely on wild resources. Bedrock mortars in California occur in concentrations, suggesting communal processing activities or repeated use over extended periods. Individual sites contain dozens to hundreds of mortar cups. The distribution of mortars across the landscape marks areas of oak woodland productivity and population aggregation. Associated village sites contain substantial midden deposits, house depressions, and artifact scatters indicating year-round or near-year-round occupation. The investment in fixed processing facilities and permanent villages represents a distinct adaptation compared to mobile foraging strategies. Pacific Northwest populations continued developing maritime adaptations. Large plank houses constructed from split cedar timbers housed extended families or multiple related families. These structures required substantial labor to build, but were used for generations. Villages occupied favorable locations near salmon streams, shellfish beds, and protected harbors. The abundance of resources allowed population concentrations higher than most foraging societies. Hierarchical social organization emerged, with ranking systems recognizing chiefs, nobles, and commoners. Salmon preservation technology in the Northwest involved filleting fish and drying them on racks. Smoke from fires underneath aided preservation and flavored the product. Storage houses protected dried salmon from moisture and pests. The quantity of salmon processed during peak runs exceeded immediate consumption needs by large margins. Stored salmon sustained populations through winter when fresh resources were limited. Control over productive fishing locations and stored surpluses may have contributed to emerging social hierarchies. The Great Basin experienced continued aridity during portions of this period. Populations remained relatively sparse and mobile. Resources were dispersed, requiring detailed environmental knowledge and flexibility in settlement patterns. Seed harvesting, small game hunting, and exploitation of scattered water sources characterized subsistence. During wetter intervals, marshes expanded and populations concentrated near productive wetlands. The fluctuating nature of Great Basin environments prevented the sedentism and population densities seen in more stable regions. Fremont culture emerged in the eastern Great Basin and Colorado Plateau around 1,700 years ago. This manifestation combined farming with continued foraging. Maize, beans, and squash were grown in favorable locations along rivers and in upland areas with sufficient moisture. Wild resources remained important, with piñon nuts, small game, and seasonal plant foods contributing substantially to diet. The Fremont represent adaptation to marginal agricultural conditions where farming supplemented rather than replaced foraging. Fremont settlements included pit houses, above-ground structures, and granaries for storing maize. Rock art, both petroglyphs and pictographs, depicts anthropomorphic figures, bighorn sheep, and geometric designs. The meaning of these images is unknown. They may represent religious beliefs, territorial markers, calendrical information, or other purposes. The presence of relatively uniform art styles across the Fremont region suggests shared symbolic systems or communication between groups. Archaeological evidence indicates increasing social differentiation and organizational complexity in several regions between 2,000 and 500 years ago. Burial practices show variation in treatment that extends beyond simple age and gender differences. Some individuals received elaborate interment with substantial grave goods, while others were buried with minimal or no accompanying items. The investment of labor and materials in mortuary treatment suggests recognized status differences, whether achieved through personal accomplishment or ascribed through kinship and inheritance. Shell bead production intensified in regions with access to marine shell sources. Beads were manufactured in standardized sizes and shapes, suggesting systematic production beyond household needs. The presence of manufacturing debris, including broken shells, unfinished beads, and drilling tools at specific sites, indicates specialized production locations. Finished beads appear widely distributed across regions lacking shell sources, demonstrating extensive exchange networks. The labor investment required to manufacture beads and their widespread distribution suggest these objects functioned as wealth items or currency in some contexts. California developed elaborate shell bead industries using marine shells from coastal areas. Olivella shell beads were produced in millions, with different styles characterizing different time periods. These beads moved through exchange networks into the Great Basin, Plateau, and Southwest. The quantity of beads at some interior sites indicates substantial accumulation of these items. Whether beads served as currency, wealth storage, or social markers cannot be definitively determined, though ethnographic accounts describe shell beads functioning in all these capacities. Clamshell disc beads in California required extensive labor to manufacture. Shells were broken, shaped into rough discs, drilled, and strung for grinding to uniform diameter. Production sites near shell sources contain massive quantities of manufacturing debris. The standardization of bead sizes and the presence of large quantities in burials suggest formalized exchange systems and wealth accumulation. Control over bead production or distribution may have contributed to emerging social hierarchies in some coastal and interior valley populations. Violence evidence increases in the archaeological record during this period in some regions. Skeletal remains show traumatic injuries consistent with interpersonal violence. Projectile points embedded in bone, depressed skull fractures, and defensive forearm injuries appear with greater frequency than earlier periods. Some sites show evidence of violent destruction with multiple individuals killed and left unburied. Whether this represents increased warfare, better skeletal preservation, larger sample sizes, or other factors remains debated. Fortified sites appear in several regions, suggesting concern with defense against attack. Palisades, ditches, and preferential location of settlements in defensible positions indicate populations' anticipated conflict. The investment in defensive architecture represents substantial labor and suggests sustained threat rather than sporadic raiding. Regional patterns in fortification timing vary, with some areas showing early defensive measures while others never developed substantial fortifications despite evidence of violence. Competition for resources may have intensified as populations grew and productive areas reached carrying capacity. Territories became more bounded and defended. Trespass into claimed areas risked violent response. Archaeological evidence for territoriality is indirect, but includes distinct material culture boundaries, differential access to resource zones, and the presence of buffer zones between population concentrations. The emergence of territorial behavior would have constrained population mobility and required greater reliance on resources within claimed areas. Trade networks expanded in geographic extent, and volume of materials moved. Marine shell from the Pacific reached the Great Plains and eastern woodlands. Gulf Coast shell appears in northern sites. Obsidian from western sources occurs in the Midwest. Copper from the Great Lakes continued moving south and west. The presence of materials from multiple distant sources at individual sites indicates participation in far-reaching exchange systems. Whether these networks involved direct long-distance travel or intermediate exchanges through connected groups cannot always be determined. Exchange mechanisms likely varied by material type and social context. Prestige items including copper, elaborate shell ornaments, and exotic stones may have moved through gift exchange between elites. Utilitarian items like stone tools possibly circulated through more informal sharing or direct barter. Marriage exchanges between groups would have facilitated material transfers alongside social relationship formation. Specialized traders may have emerged in some regions, though archaeological evidence for such specialists is ambiguous. Mound construction began in the eastern woodlands during the late Archaic period, around 5,000 years ago. Poverty Point in Louisiana represents the most elaborate late Archaic earthwork complex. The site includes massive earthen ridges arranged in concentric semicircles and several large mounds. The labor investment required for these constructions indicates organized effort involving substantial populations. The purpose of these earthworks remains uncertain, though suggestions include ceremonial functions, elite residences, or astronomical alignments. Poverty Point artifact assemblages include elaborate stone and clay objects not found in typical habitation sites. Plummets, birdstones, and other carefully crafted items suggest ceremonial or prestige functions. Stone materials originated from sources hundreds of kilometers distant, indicating far-reaching connections. The concentration of exotic materials and elaborate constructions suggests Poverty Point functioned as a regional center, possibly for trade, ceremony, or political integration. Population estimates for the site range from hundreds to thousands, though permanent versus seasonal occupation remains debated. Burial mounds in the eastern woodlands contained multiple individuals interred over extended periods. Some mounds included primary burials with elaborate grave goods, while others contained secondary bundle burials with minimal accompaniment. Exotic materials including marine shell, copper, and non-local stone appear with select individuals. The differential treatment indicates recognized status hierarchies. Whether these hierarchies were based on achieved status, inherited rank, age, gender, or other criteria cannot be determined from burial context alone. Leadership structures necessary for organizing mound construction and managing exchange networks likely existed in regions showing evidence of these activities. Chiefs or other recognized leaders could mobilize labor, coordinate construction efforts, and manage relationships with distant groups. Archaeological evidence for leadership is indirect, inferred from differential burial treatment, the scale of public works, and the distribution of prestige items. Direct evidence, such as symbols of office or residential distinctions between elite and commoner households, is limited or absent for this period. Religious or ceremonial systems are evidenced by specialized structures, elaborate burials, and symbolic objects. Rock art in various regions depicts anthropomorphic figures, animals, and geometric designs. Carved stone pipes sometimes take animal or anthropomorphic forms. Copper ornaments occasionally represent animals or abstract symbols. The meaning of these symbols is lost, though their careful manufacture and contexts suggest ritual significance. Archaeologists avoid detailed interpretation without supporting evidence, acknowledging that symbolic systems are culturally specific and not reconstructible from material remains alone. Great Lakes populations continued copperworking traditions. Objects manufactured from native copper included utilitarian tools and ornamental items. By this period, ornamental uses dominated over functional tools. Copper beads, pendants, and decorative elements appear in burials and habitation sites. The labor required to manufacture copper objects and their distribution beyond source areas indicates these items held value. Whether value derived from rarity, symbolic associations, or aesthetic properties cannot be determined. Carved shell gorgets appeared in the southeast, particularly during the later portions of this period. These ornaments were cut from large marine shells and engraved with complex designs, including human figures, raptorial birds, and geometric patterns. The skill required for manufacture and the elaborate iconography suggest specialized craftspeople and shared symbolic systems. Gorgets appear primarily in elite burials, indicating association with high status. The distribution of similar designs across wide areas suggests communication of ideological concepts or participation in shared ceremonial systems. Platform pipes carved from stone appeared in the Midwest and Southeast. These pipes show sophisticated sculptural representation of animals, birds, and occasionally human figures. The realism and technical skill evident in the best examples indicate specialized artisans. Pipes appear in burial contexts with individuals who also received other elaborate grave goods, suggesting association with elite status. The function of pipes beyond smoking is unknown, though ceremonial or social bonding uses are likely based on ethnographic parallels. Ceramic technology spread across much of eastern North America during this period. Regional traditions developed distinct vessel forms, decorative styles, and tempering materials. Pottery allowed new food processing methods, particularly extended boiling of seeds and other plant foods. Ceramic diversity increased through time, with decorative elaboration and formal variation marking regional and temporal boundaries. Archaeologists use ceramic styles to define archaeological phases and trace population movements or interaction patterns. Population growth across North America is indicated by increasing site frequencies, larger settlement sizes, and more intensive exploitation of available resources. Regional population densities varied considerably based on environmental productivity. California, the Pacific Northwest, and portions of the eastern woodlands supported higher densities than the Great Basin, Arctic, or portions of the plains. Total continental population estimates for the period between 2,000 and 500 years ago range from several hundred thousand to over 1 million, though precise figures remain speculative and contested among researchers. Settlement patterns shifted toward greater sedentism in regions with reliable and abundant resources. Year-round villages appeared in California, the Pacific Northwest, and parts of the eastern woodlands. These settlements contained substantial houses, storage facilities, and accumulated midden deposits indicating extended occupation. Population mobility decreased as groups invested in facilities and developed detailed knowledge of local resource scheduling. However, many regions retained highly mobile settlement systems with seasonal movements between resource zones. Resource intensification characterized subsistence strategies in areas with growing populations. Exploitation of previously underutilized foods increased. Small seeds that required substantial processing effort were harvested in greater quantities. Fish and shellfish were taken more systematically. Nut groves were possibly managed through selective burning or other practices. This intensification represented responses to population pressure, climate variation, or cultural preferences for particular settlement patterns. The archaeological signature includes increased frequencies of processing tools and broader diet breadth. Fishing technology innovations improved catch efficiency. Togglehead harpoons with detachable points appeared in contexts where marine mammals or large fish were pursued. Composite fishhooks with bone points lashed to wooden or bone shanks allowed targeting of specific species. Gorges, small pointed bones or stones that lodged in fish throats when swallowed, were attached to lines for passive fishing. These varied technologies indicate detailed understanding of fish behavior and anatomy. The labor invested in manufacturing specialized equipment suggests fishing was a significant subsistence activity. Weirs and fish traps constructed from stone or wood channeled migrating fish into enclosures where they could be harvested efficiently. Stone alignments in rivers mark locations where these facilities existed. Wooden stakes preserved in waterlogged contexts show construction details. These facilities represented substantial labor investment, but provided reliable returns when positioned on productive migration routes. Ownership or control of productive fishing locations may have contributed to wealth differences and social hierarchy in some populations. Deer hunting in forested regions employed various strategies, including individual stalking, communal drives, and possibly decoys or calls to attract animals within range. Fire was potentially used to create edge environments favored by deer and to drive animals toward waiting hunters. The ubiquity of deer remains in eastern woodland sites, indicates these animals were reliably harvested. Hunting technology included atlatls in earlier portions of this period, transitioning to bow and arrow in later centuries. The bow and arrow appeared in North America at different times in different regions. The earliest evidence appears around 2,000 years ago in the Arctic. The technology spread southward, reaching most regions by 1,500 to 1,000 years ago. Bows offered advantages over atlatls, including faster shooting rate, easier portability, and potentially greater accuracy at medium ranges. Arrow points were smaller and lighter than dart points, requiring less stone and allowing more projectiles to be carried. The adoption of bow technology affected hunting strategies, warfare tactics, and stone tool industries. Small, corner-notched and side-notched arrow points characterize assemblages from the period following bow adoption. These points show regional variation in size and form, but are consistently smaller than earlier dart points. Manufacturing techniques remained similar to earlier biface production, but operated at reduced scales. The presence of small points in contexts with human skeletal trauma indicates bows were used in interpersonal violence as well as hunting. The military implications of bow technology may have influenced patterns of conflict and defensive site placement. Plant cultivation expanded in several regions during this period, though wild resource exploitation remained dominant in most areas. The eastern woodlands saw cultivation of indigenous seed plants, including sunflower, sumpweed, goosefoot, and squash. These plants were grown in small gardens, likely in disturbed soils near habitations or in floodplain settings. Yields supplemented wild foods rather than replacing them. Population density and settlement permanence were not dramatically affected by this early cultivation, suggesting it represented intensification within existing subsistence systems rather than fundamental reorganization. Maize agriculture intensified in the Southwest between 1,500 and 1,000 years ago. Improved varieties adapted to shorter growing seasons, and lower moisture allowed farming in previously marginal areas. Populations aggregated in villages near arable land. Storage facilities for maize increased in size and number. However, wild resources, including piñon nuts, game, and gathered plants, continued contributing significantly to diet. The balance between farming and foraging varied by region, elevation, and climate conditions. Hohokam culture in southern Arizona developed extensive irrigation canal systems to support agriculture in arid environments. Canals diverted water from the Gila and Salt rivers to fields located at some distance from river channels. The engineering required for canal construction, maintenance, and water management indicates sophisticated technical knowledge and organizational capacity. The labor investment in canal systems represented commitment to specific locations and farming economies. Populations aggregated in villages near irrigated fields. Hohokam settlements included pit houses, above-ground adobe structures, and ball courts similar to those found in Mesoamerica. Ball courts suggest contact with or influence from Mexican cultures. Other Mesoamerican influences include copper bells, shell trumpets, carved shell ornaments, and possibly ceremonial practices. The extent and nature of these contacts remain debated. Whether contacts involved direct trade relationships, population movements, or indirect transmission through intermediaries cannot be determined definitively. The presence of Mesoamerican-style artifacts and architectural features demonstrates at minimum long-distance information exchange. Ancestral Pueblo populations in the Four Corners region transitioned from pit houses to above-ground masonry structures around 1,200 years ago. Room blocks of contiguous masonry rooms housed multiple families. Kivas, circular semi-subterranean ceremonial structures, were incorporated into settlements. Population aggregation increased, with some sites containing hundreds of rooms. These developments occurred as maize agriculture intensified and populations grew. However, wild resources remained important, with hunting and gathering continuing alongside farming. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico emerged as a major center between 1,000 and 900 years ago. Great houses constructed from stone masonry and timber reached multiple stories and contained hundreds of rooms. Roads radiating from Chaco connected outlying communities to the canyon. The labor investment in construction, the presence of exotic materials including turquoise and macaw feathers from Mexico, and the architectural elaboration suggest Chaco functioned as a political and ceremonial center. The nature of Chacoan organization remains debated, with proposals ranging from theocratic control to egalitarian ceremonial cooperation. Mississippian culture emerged in the eastern woodlands around 1,000 years ago. This cultural manifestation was characterized by intensive maize agriculture, large permanent settlements, platform mound construction, and evidence of social hierarchy. The largest Mississippian site, Cahokia in Illinois, covered approximately 15 square kilometers and contained over 100 earthen mounds. Population estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 at the site's peak around 900 years ago. Cahokia's size and complexity exceeded any previous North American settlement north of Mexico. Mississippian subsistence centered on maize agriculture, supplemented by beans, squash, and wild resources. Agricultural intensification supported higher population densities than earlier eastern woodland populations. Settlements were organized hierarchically, with mound centers surrounded by dispersed farmsteads. Elite residences occupied mound summits while commoners lived in smaller structures around plazas. This settlement pattern reflects social stratification more pronounced than earlier periods. Control over agricultural surplus, exotic trade goods, and labor mobilization likely concentrated in elite hands. Platform mounds in Mississippian sites served as foundations for elite structures, temples, or mortuaries. Mound construction involved organized labor moving earth in basket loads. The largest mounds represent hundreds of thousands of person-hours of labor. Mound-top structures were periodically destroyed and rebuilt with new mounds layers added. This pattern suggests cyclical ritual renewal or succession of leaders. The investment in public architecture indicates organized political systems capable of mobilizing substantial labor forces. Trade networks during the Mississippian period extended across much of eastern North America and into adjacent regions. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast moved northward in substantial quantities. Copper from the Great Lakes appeared in southern sites. Mica from the Appalachians was worked into ornamental forms and distributed widely. Galena from Missouri and Wisconsin sources was used for pigment and ornaments. The concentration of exotic materials at mound centers compared to dispersed settlements suggests elites controlled or preferentially accessed long-distance exchange networks. Specialized craft production is evidenced by concentrations of manufacturing debris and standardized artifact forms. Shell bead production at some sites shows workshop-scale operations with thousands of beads manufactured. Stone tool production for export occurred at quarries where high-quality chert was extracted and processed into blanks for distribution. Copperworking involved smelting and cold hammering native copper into ornamental forms. The organization of craft production, whether attached to elite households or independent specialists, cannot always be determined from archaeological contexts alone. Prestige goods distinguished elite from commoner populations. Elaborate shell gorgets, copper plates embossed with iconographic designs, stone effigy pipes, and decorated ceramics appear predominantly in elite burial contexts and mound-top structures. These objects show shared iconographic themes across wide areas, including human figures in distinctive poses, raptorial birds, serpents, and complex geometric designs. The iconography represents religious or political symbolism that archaeologists term the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. The specific meanings remain unknown without textual sources or direct cultural continuity. Mississippian political organization likely involved chiefdoms with hereditary leadership. Chiefs controlled agricultural surplus, organized labor for mound construction, managed trade relationships, and possibly held religious authority. Archaeological evidence for chiefdoms includes hierarchical settlement patterns, elaborate elite burials, prestige goods concentration in elite contexts, and the scale of public architecture. Whether individual chiefs controlled single mound centers or paramount chiefs ruled multiple communities remains debated and probably varied by region and time period. Warfare appears to have been significant during the Mississippian period. Fortifications including palisades and bastions surrounded many settlements. Skeletal evidence shows high frequencies of violent trauma. Some sites were destroyed by fire with evidence of unburied bodies. Mass graves containing individuals showing traumatic injuries appear at several locations. Whether warfare involved raiding for captives, territorial expansion, or resource competition cannot be determined definitively. The presence of defensive architecture indicates sustained threat rather than occasional conflict. Population aggregation in mound centers created sanitation challenges and increased disease transmission. Dense populations concentrated waste and contaminated water sources. Increased interpersonal contact facilitated spread of communicable diseases. Skeletal evidence shows health problems, including nutritional stress, infectious disease, and dental pathologies associated with high carbohydrate diets. Despite these health challenges, populations maintained dense settlements, suggesting social or economic advantages outweighed health costs. Mississippian expansion from core areas along the Mississippi River Valley extended influence into surrounding regions. Outlying populations adopted aspects of Mississippian culture, including mound building, maize agriculture, and ceramic styles. Whether this expansion involved population migration, cultural diffusion, or political incorporation varied by region. Some areas show evidence of Mississippian colonies established in previously occupied territories. Others show gradual adoption of Mississippian traits by local populations. The mechanisms of Mississippian expansion remain subjects of archaeological investigation. Cahokia's decline began around 800 years ago. Population decreased substantially. Mound construction ceased. The site was largely abandoned by 600 years ago. Reasons for collapse are debated. Climate deterioration, environmental degradation from overexploitation, political instability, and disease have all been proposed. Regional Mississippian centers continued functioning after Cahokia's decline, suggesting local rather than system-wide collapse. The specific trigger for Cahokia's abandonment may involve multiple factors operating simultaneously. Plains populations during this period continued bison hunting, but with evidence of increasing sedentism in some regions. Villages with substantial earth lodge structures appeared along major river valleys. These populations combined bison hunting with farming of maize, beans, and squash. The balance between hunting and agriculture varied by location and climate conditions. River valleys provided water for crops and attracted game animals. Upland areas were used seasonally for hunting, but not permanent settlement. Earth lodges were circular structures with timber frameworks covered by earth. These substantial dwellings housed extended families and provided insulation against temperature extremes. Villages of dozens of earth lodges indicate sedentary populations numbering in the hundreds. The investment in construction suggests reduced mobility compared to earlier plains populations. Storage pits within and around lodges held agricultural produce and dried meat. The presence of storage facilities indicates planning for seasonal scarcity and surplus accumulation. Nomadic bison hunting continued on the high plains, where agriculture was not feasible due to low precipitation. These populations maintained high mobility, following bison herds seasonally. Teepee structures, which were portable and quickly assembled, replaced the substantial dwellings of sedentary groups. The archaeological signature of highly mobile populations is limited, consisting primarily of kill sites, processing locations, and temporary camps. The lack of substantial structures or large artifact assemblages at individual sites reflects frequent movement and portable material culture. Great Basin populations remained largely mobile foragers throughout this period. Sedentism did not develop except in limited areas with exceptional resource concentrations. Population densities stayed low. Subsistence continued to emphasize seed gathering, small game hunting, and exploitation of seasonal resources. The harsh environment and resource scarcity prevented the population growth and settlement aggregation seen in more productive regions. Archaeological sites consist of rock shelters, temporary camps, and resource processing locations scattered across the landscape. California populations reached peak densities during the late prehistoric period. Acorn harvesting and processing supported sedentary villages. Marine and riverine resources supplemented plant foods. Population estimates for California at European contact suggest several 100,000 people, higher than any comparable foraging region globally. This density was supported by environmental productivity, detailed resource knowledge accumulated over millennia, and technologies for harvesting and processing diverse foods. Northwest Coast populations developed pronounced social hierarchies without agriculture. Chiefs controlled access to productive salmon streams and coordinated labor for fish harvesting and processing. Wealth accumulation occurred through control of resources and labor. Potlatch ceremonies involved competitive gift-giving and resource distribution that established and maintained social rank. Slavery existed, with captives taken in raids serving elite households. The complexity of Northwest Coast societies rivaled agricultural chiefdoms elsewhere, demonstrating that agriculture was not prerequisite for social stratification. Plank houses on the Northwest Coast reached substantial sizes, housing multiple related families. These structures were constructed from split cedar planks and carved posts. House posts and facade poles displayed carved crests representing lineage affiliations and social standing. The investment in permanent architecture and the elaboration of decoration indicate wealth concentration and social competition. Houses were owned by lineages and passed through inheritance, representing persistent social units transcending individual lifespans. Arctic populations adapted to extreme environments with specialized technologies for hunting marine mammals and caribou. Toggling harpoons, float systems for large whale hunting, kayaks for individual hunting, and umiaks for group transport enabled exploitation of Arctic resources. Winter houses were semi-subterranean structures insulated with sod. Summer dwellings consisted of skin tents that could be transported during seasonal movements. Population densities remained low due to resource limitations and environmental harshness. Population estimates at the time of European contact vary considerably, depending on methodology and regional data quality. Comprehensive estimates for North America north of Mexico range from 2 million to 18 million, with most researchers favoring figures between 5 and 10 million. Regional densities varied enormously. California may have contained 300,000 or more people. The eastern woodlands supported substantial populations in river valleys and coastal areas. The Great Basin held perhaps 50,000 people, scattered across vast territories. These estimates derive from early European observations, archaeological site densities, carrying capacity calculations, and backward projections from later census data. European contact began in different regions at different times. Norse explorers reached northeastern North America around 1,000 years ago, but established no permanent presence. Spanish expeditions explored the Caribbean, Florida, and the southwest, beginning in the late 15th century. French explorers penetrated the St. Lawrence Valley and Great Lakes region in the 16th century. English colonization of the Atlantic coast began in the early 17th century. Russian contact occurred along the Pacific coast and Alaska in the 18th century. The chronology and intensity of contact varied regionally, producing different demographic and cultural impacts. Disease introduction caused catastrophic population collapse across the continent. European and African diseases, including smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza, encountered populations with no prior exposure or acquired immunity. Mortality rates during epidemics reached 50 to 90% in affected communities. Diseases spread along trade routes ahead of direct European contact, devastating populations before they encountered colonizers. The scale of mortality disrupted social systems, eliminated specialized knowledge holders, and fragmented political organizations. Survivor populations often consolidated, merged with neighboring groups, or relocated to avoid disease and colonial pressures. Smallpox was particularly devastating due to high mortality, disfigurement of survivors, and rapid transmission. The disease spread through respiratory droplets, allowing transmission before symptoms appeared. In dense settlements, entire populations could be infected within weeks. Without prior exposure, native populations lacked both biological immunity and cultural knowledge of disease management. Traditional healing practices were ineffective against novel pathogens. The psychological impact of watching communities die compounded physical mortality as social structures collapsed and subsistence activities ceased during epidemics. Depopulation occurred rapidly in some regions and more gradually in others. Caribbean populations were largely eliminated within decades of contact. Southeast populations declined severely during the 16th century. California populations collapsed during the Spanish mission period in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The timing and severity of decline correlated with intensity of European presence, though diseases often preceded sustained contact. By the 19th century, continental population had declined to perhaps 500,000 or fewer, representing catastrophic reduction from pre-contact levels. Social disruption accompanied demographic collapse. Leadership systems dependent on hereditary succession failed when chiefly lineages were eliminated. Specialized knowledge held by elders was lost when entire generations died. Agricultural systems requiring coordinated labor collapsed when populations fell below critical thresholds. Trade networks fragmented as participant groups disappeared or relocated. The archaeological record shows abandonment of major centers, cessation of mound building, and disruption of material culture traditions across multiple regions. Mississippian chiefdoms were declining or had already collapsed in many areas before sustained European contact. Cahokia was abandoned by the time Europeans entered the interior. Other mound centers showed reduced populations or complete abandonment. Whether these collapses resulted from internal factors, early disease introduction, or climate deterioration remains debated. Spanish expeditions in the 16th century encountered some functioning chiefdoms, but also abandoned mound centers and dispersed populations. By the 18th century, the Mississippian political system had entirely dissolved. Plains populations experienced disruption from multiple sources. Disease reduced numbers substantially. Introduction of horses from Spanish sources in the 17th century transformed mobility and hunting strategies. Some formerly sedentary groups abandoned agriculture and villages to adopt nomadic bison hunting facilitated by horses. The archaeological record shows abandonment of earth lodge villages in some regions during this period. Whether abandonment resulted from disease mortality, economic transformation, or conflict cannot always be determined. Southwest populations faced Spanish colonization beginning in the 16th century, with intensified missionization in the 17th century. Pueblo populations declined from disease and colonial disruption. Spanish demands for labor and agricultural tribute strained subsistence systems. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 temporarily expelled Spanish colonizers, but resulted in population displacement and conflict. Spanish return in the 1690s reimposed colonial control. Population continued declining through the colonial period, with some pueblos abandoned and survivors consolidating into remaining settlements. California populations were devastated during the Spanish mission period, beginning in 1769. Missions concentrated populations in dense settlements where diseases spread rapidly. Mortality rates were extraordinarily high. Traditional subsistence patterns were disrupted as populations were confined to mission grounds. By the mid-19th century, California's native population had declined from perhaps 300,000 to fewer than 100,000. The Gold Rush and American settlement period brought additional mortality and displacement. By the late 19th century, fewer than 20,000 remained. Northwest coast populations declined from disease, but maintained cultural continuity better than many regions. The abundance of resources and dispersed settlement patterns may have reduced disease transmission compared to dense agricultural settlements. European and American maritime traders in the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought diseases but did not immediately colonize the coast. Population decline occurred, but was less catastrophic than in some regions. Cultural practices, including potlatching and social hierarchies, persisted into the colonial period, though under increasing pressure from Canadian and American authorities. Arctic populations experienced delayed contact compared to southern regions. Russian contact in Alaska began in the 18th century. Canadian Arctic populations encountered European whalers and explorers in the 19th century. Disease introduction occurred, but populations were already small and dispersed. The harsh environment limited colonial settlement. Traditional subsistence practices continued longer in Arctic regions than elsewhere. However, incorporation into fur trade economies and later colonial administration eventually transformed traditional lifeways. Great Basin populations remained relatively isolated until the mid-19th century. Spanish exploration reached the region, but permanent settlement was limited. American expansion in the 1840s brought rapid disruption. Mining camps, ranching, and transcontinental transportation routes fragmented traditional territories. Populations declined from disease and violence. Traditional subsistence patterns were disrupted as resource areas were occupied or degraded. By the late 19th century, surviving populations were confined to reservations or lived in marginal areas avoided by colonizers. The archaeological record of the contact period shows disruption of traditional material culture patterns. European trade goods, including metal tools, glass beads, and ceramics, appear in sites dating to early contact. Traditional artifact types declined or disappeared as European manufactures replaced indigenous productions. Settlement patterns changed as populations relocated away from disease centers, consolidated for defense, or moved to access trade opportunities. The material evidence documents rapid and fundamental transformation of native societies across the continent. Prehistoric North America encompassed tremendous cultural diversity adapted to varied environments. Populations developed sophisticated technologies, extensive trade networks, and complex social organizations without writing, metallurgy beyond copperworking, or wheeled transport. The diversity of adaptations ranged from Arctic marine mammal hunters to California acorn processors to Mississippian agriculturalists. This variation reflected environmental constraints, historical trajectories, and accumulated cultural knowledge specific to each region. European contact terminated these independent developments and inaugurated demographic catastrophe that eliminated most of the population and disrupted cultural continuity across the continent.